You are listening to Love Bits. Episode 3, Deja Vu. Since she was 13, Stacy Clarkson had carried a private weather system inside her, a cycle of moonlit currents that gathered when she slept and receded when she woke. It announced itself as a scene she could not stop returning to, a cafe window trembling with soft rain, the scent of ground coffee hovering over the small sound of porcelain on wood, the kind of afternoon light that turned dust into galaxies. In the dream, a man's voice would rise behind her, clear enough to feel like touch. "Madam, madam." She turned, and there he stood, already short of breath, as if the very act of seeing her had knocked something loose inside him. He held out a small leather notebook she had left on the table and tilted his head with a smile she felt in the center of her chest. "Did you lose something?" Then came the introduction that anchored everything and never finished. "Hi, my name is Alex." The dream always glitched at the brink, the last name shattering into static and reforming as a single letter, R. She woke holding that letter the way a body holds heat, with an ache that did not belong to any morning. In her 20s, she named the ache longing and treated it like a minor superstition. In her early 30s, when marriage had sharpened into a life that did not fit, the dream withdrew, as if it were polite enough to leave the room while she dismantled what she had built. When the divorce papers were finally inked and stacked and slid across a table, the dream returned with a clarity that made her catch the edge of the counter and wait for the room to steady. She told Mary, because Mary had known all versions of her. They had met in college when Mary barreled into Stacy's quiet like sunlight through a window you didn't know could open. Now, years later, Mary wore her hair like a banner and her bracelets like punctuation and her love as the kind of loyalty that made a person braver. She listened while Stacy described the old dream reawakened, how the voice behind her said, "Madam, madam," how the notebook waited in a stranger's hand, how the name Alex ended with a broken letter on the tongue. "You've got to stop chasing a ghost, babe," Mary said, mixing mischief with tenderness, a bright shawl thrown over pragmatic concern. "Dream guy is not guy. He doesn't take out the trash. He doesn't do laundry. He's not going to show up and say, 'Surprise! I folded your fitted sheets into origami swans.'" "I don't want origami swans," Stacy said, trying for humor and landing on confession. It feels like the beginning of a sentence I didn't get to finish." "Then finish a different sentence," Mary said, softer now, still protective. "One you can actually write." That night, with the divorce finalized and their future a blank page that frightened and thrilled them both, they opened a bottle of Pinot Noir and decided to do something ceremonial and ridiculous. They staged a mock seance followed by what Mary called a house cleansing. They dimmed the lights and lit mismatched candles that smelled like vanilla and linen closets. Mary dramatically waved a feather duster as if it were a censer. "Spirits of bad decisions and mediocre exes, begone," she intoned. Stacy nearly fell off the couch laughing. "Amplify that for the neighbors. Let them know freedom is contagious." Mary thumped her chest with the feather duster and swept the air in slow circles, eyes half-lidded in parody. "I now proclaim, this house is clear." They cackled until tears glistened and then, because they could not resist turning silliness into science, they downloaded ghost hunting apps onto their phones. The apartment filled with ridiculous beeps and blue dots on screens. "Mary, you have a presence next to your TV," Stacy whispered in a conspirator's hush. Mary gasped like a debutante at a scandal. "It's not my husband?" Stacy snorted so hard she choked. Mary cocked her head as though listening through a wall. "Did you hear that disembodied voice?" "That was my stomach," Stacy said. "I'm hungry." They ate cold pizza over the sink, leaned against countertops like survivors of a battle fought with laughter. Later, they fell asleep on the couch, the phones with their silly specters glowing dimly, and Stacy woke with the rare blessing of having laughed so hard that sleep had washed her clean. In the weeks that followed, she reorganized her life like a room. Real estate offered a ladder for her energy to climb. She studied contracts with the intensity of a person who knew how much a good signature could change the horizon. She sold 2 small houses that smelled like new carpet and brewing hope. She shook hands with couples who held each other's fingers like life preservers. She bought a better pair of flats and stood taller without noticing. The dream receded to a soft weather pattern, not a storm. On a Tuesday that tasted like late spring, cool at 8, warm by 11, sweet with the faint bruised green smell of new leaves, Stacy showed a house in an old money neighborhood where the sidewalks were smug with history. Afterward, hungry and a little giddy from doing well, she ducked into a modest diner half hidden between boutiques that wore their glass like expensive perfume. The door chimed in a voice that made promises it didn't have to keep. Inside, the air was thick with coffee and a whisper of frying oil. A waitress with a crown of pencil-skewered hair set down water and smiled the slow smile of someone who has seen every variety of human hurry and knows most of it is unnecessary. Stacy ordered a salad and opened the real estate app that had turned her into a better version of herself. She was composing a text when something tugged. The sense, strong and unarguable, that the light had shifted around someone. A man sat 3 tables away with his back to her, shoulders squared in the way of a person who asks a lot of himself. A binder lay open beside his plate like a bird mid-flight. He wrote in it quickly, the gestures economical and alive. He glanced up at the wall clock, then at his watch, then back at the page, as if he could bend time by writing faster. She told herself not to make stories about strangers. She made a story anyway. He stood so abruptly his chair scraped like a sharp exhale. He grabbed his jacket, left the binder, and rushed toward the door. Hey, you forgot something, she called, voice spiking with instinctive urgency. He didn't turn. The waitress looked up. A couple paused mid-bite. Stacy was already moving. Body first, brain later, snatching the binder and pushing through the door into daylight that felt a touch too bright. Outside, the street contained several small calamities and the seeds of several more. A bicyclist swerved with a word that might have been a curse or a benediction. A car braked, tires squealing like startled animals. A chalkboard sign advertising the daily special, meatloaf, unapologetic, wobbled, then toppled as Stacy skimmed past it. She sprinted, binder tight against her side, until she saw the man veer into a park, sunlight stippling the path through barely leafed branches. She followed into cool green, the ground soft underfoot, the air humming with early insects, and the faint, damp metal smell of a sprinkler somewhere. He disappeared into a thicker stand of trees. For a moment the path dimmed, then opened into a clearing bright with a baseball diamond. The field's clay glowed the color of rusted peaches. Children in 2 inconsistent shades of blue and orange pivoted and shouted and became comets. Parents clapped with the fierce, polite intensity of people who would kill for their children, but were content, for now, to cheer. Stacy stood bent at the waist, catching her breath, binder pressed to her sternum, as if her heart needed a lid. Across the field, the man sat on the bleachers beside another man. He wasn't out of breath anymore. He was laughing with the small, private laughter of friends who solve problems together. The team in blue looked scrappy and delighted by their own existence, so Stacy adopted them. When they won, she smiled without deciding to. Then she walked the long edge of the field, each step writing a sentence she wasn't willing to read yet. "Did you forget something?" she asked softly when she reached him, practical words with a seam of quivering wonder. She held out the binder. He turned. It was a simple act, but the world tipped as though he had shifted a continent. The face that met her felt both foreign and known, like a word in a language you don't speak but have always loved. His eyes were gray-green with a rim like the darker edge of sea glass. He glanced at the binder and back at her with a look that admitted a fact both had felt, that something had recognized something. "Have you ever experienced déjà vu?" he asked, low and thin with wonder, as if he were listening to his voice while he spoke. "Not really," she said, grabbing for a handrail made of humor. "But maybe DEJA who?" He smiled, brief and startled, then grateful. Up close, she saw a thin scar along his jaw, the kind life gives you for surviving small disasters. His hands were long-fingered and ink-smudged, the fingernails clean the way a person with good habits keeps them. He took the binder. His fingers brushed hers, and a clean current ran up her wrist. Attention, not alarm. "I chased you through a small minefield of city chaos to return this," she said, still catching her breath. "Thank you," he said. "My godson's game. I was late." A child in an oversized blue jersey waved from the far bleachers and shouted something like, "Uncle! Uncle!" The man lifted his chin in answer before turning back to her. The field breathed around them. She took a breath, too. "What's your name?" she asked, soft but direct. He hesitated, just a fraction her body noticed before her mind did. "Carl," he said, landing the word lightly, measured, as if setting down a glass that could crack. Disappointment arrived with ridiculous speed, like stepping off a curb you didn't know was a stair. The name she'd kept pressed inside, Alex, did not appear. She smiled the smile that said, "Nice to meet you," even when her stomach folded over itself. "Well, Carl, your binder and your godson's game are safely reunited." She turned to go because it felt like the only way to keep the air moving in her lungs, but he spoke again, urgency pulling the vowels toward her. "Wait, please." She paused, the binder under his arm now, the afternoon quieting its brightness around them. "Yes?" she said, wary but open, a door on a chain. "Are you Stacy?" he asked, lowering his voice as if he were stepping onto a bridge he couldn't see. Her name in his mouth felt like a window opened from the inside. "How do you know that?" she asked, startled wonder braided with caution. He swallowed, looking like a boy found in the act of believing something unbelievable. "I've dreamed about you," he said, "since I was a teenager. My best friend, Earl, told me to give up the ghost, literally. I tried. But then today, you, the binder, this field. I thought, maybe I should stop ignoring whatever this is. I'm not trying to be a weirdo. I just recognized you." The words touched two places inside her at once. The tidy shelf where she kept impossible hope, and the locked drawer where she kept fear that she was easy to read or easy to hurt. She stood between them and chose neither. "There's a cafe on Sutter and Ninth," she said at last. "Tomorrow, 11. If you're there, we'll talk. If you're not, we won't." "I'll be there," he said, relief loosening his shoulders. They parted like people who had set down a heavy box and agreed to pick it up tomorrow. Stacy walked home with the strange sensation that the world around her had slightly crisper edges. The cracks in the sidewalk looked intentional. The clouds had neat hems. She found Mary on her couch, pretending to read a magazine and actually waiting to interrogate. "You're glowing," Mary said, launching with detective glee. "Did you find out you're descended from queens? Did you eat a donut you didn't tell me about?" "I chased a man through traffic," Stacy said, unable to disguise the tremor. "Gave him a binder back. We're meeting for coffee tomorrow." Mary blinked like a cat deciding whether to pounce. "His name isn't Alex, right? Please tell me his name is something extremely non-committal, like Dean, or possibly Todd." "He said his name was Carl," Stacy answered, dry to inoculate against magic. "Okay, Carl is a harmless name," Mary said, softening by a hair before sharpening again. "But he said? Why do I hear a second shoe hovering above our heads?" "He knew my name," Stacy said, careful. "He said he's dreamed about me." Mary pinched the bridge of her nose and then leaned forward, affection brightening the scold. "Go. But promise me you'll keep the keys to your own car. If he starts saying words like destiny, I'm throwing a drink in his face on principle." I promise to keep my hands on the wheel, Stacy said. The cafe at Sutter and Ninth wore exposed brick and good light the way a person wears a beloved sweater. Plants dangled in macrame nets like a 70s time capsule made tender. The bell on the door was a single sweet note that made everyone look up and smile. Stacy arrived early and chose a table by the window, where watching the street made waiting feel like participation. She counted the small reliabilities that calm a nervous heart. The espresso machine hissing like a hospitable dragon, the barista's tattoo of a fern unfurling toward her wrist, the stack of mismatched saucers that said, "We are particular but not precious." He came at 11 exactly, wearing a blue button-down like a promise and a look that admitted he'd slept badly. He saw her in the way a needle finds north, without searching, without triumph. He set something on the chair beside him that looked too heavy for its size. The binder. He sat and wrapped both hands around his cup when it arrived, as if heat were a language he understood. "Hi," he said gently. "Hi," she replied, a small, involuntary smile warming her cheeks. They talked first about safe things, the city's weird habit of blooming all at once, the way the trains under the streets felt like whales. She watched how he listened with his whole face, how his eyebrows, untrustworthy in less tender men, were earnest and alive. He watched how she edited her own words as they came, choosing a cleaner sentence if too much feeling threatened to spill. He reached for the binder with the body language of someone about to ask permission. "I want to show you something," he said, voice soft at the edges. "I know how this sounds. If you want me to stop, I stop. If you want me to put this away and never bring it up again, I will. But this is why I recognized you." He opened the binder and angled it toward her the way you show someone a photograph you're not sure they'll want to see. Inside were pages written and rewritten, the margins scabbed with notes, the dates climbing past years like rungs. He turned to a page where the handwriting steadied into confession. "I don't know if she's real, and I don't know if writing makes me crazier or less. But if she is real, maybe she'll recognize the way I say things, slanted, careful, like slipping a letter under a door and walking away before anyone opens it." He turned another page, and Stacy felt the blood slip from her face. It was all small, ordinary, ungoogleable, a girl in 6th grade who gave pencils names to make math feel companionable, a chipped bowl in a mother's kitchen with a crack like a crooked smile, a night with a friend named Mary who shouted, "It's not my husband?" into the darkness and then laughed until she couldn't breathe. "Do you hear what this is?" she asked, voice thinning with alarm and a pain that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with being witnessed without consent. "Do you hear how it sounds? Like trespassing, like you've been reading my diary from the ceiling." He flinched as if the word had struck bone, then held up his hands, palms out, empty. "I know," he said. "I know it sounds like theft. It never felt like choice. I tried not to write. I tried to forget. It leaked. I wrote to put it somewhere besides my head. I'm sorry you are seeing this through the worst possible lens first. I would never have shown you if I didn't think honesty was the only honorable route through something I didn't ask for." "And if you think this is destiny," she said, spine steel true, "then where do I get to say yes or no?" "That's exactly why I wanted to show you now," he said, voice steadier, humble. "So you could say no with the whole picture. So if you say yes to a second coffee, it's to me, not to an idea. So if you walk away, you can do it with your head up." She closed the binder like someone who had decided to walk around a sleeping animal instead of pet it. The coffee had gone cool. The afternoon light shifted. Someone opened the door. Cold air fanned past. The bell chimed. "I need air," she said, a polite line that was also a boundary. She stood, and in the small storm of standing, her bag tipped. Her own notebook slid out and hit the floor open to her handwriting. Words that belonged to her faced ceiling and stranger at once. She grabbed for it, but he was already out of his chair, already crouched with hands that did not touch the page. He looked up from that posture, something like reverence dilating his eyes. "Stacy, wait," he said, urgent but gentle. "Your notebook." She reached for it, the bell on the door chiming again as she stepped into light. The world outside smelled like roasted nuts and wet concrete, like rain that could not decide whether to arrive. She made it 3 paces. Then his voice found her again on the sidewalk where the city braided everyone's stories without asking permission. "I'm sorry," he said, breathless and earnest. "I don't want to take anything you're not giving. Here, your notebook, and if you tell me to stop, I stop. If you tell me to throw the binder away, I will. I need to say one more true thing before you decide who I am to you." She didn't trust words yet, so she nodded. He took a half step back as if to give the truth room. "My first name isn't Carl," he said, shedding his last layer of caution. "It's the name I've used to protect the tender parts when the story sounded too strange for daylight. My real name is Alex Rogue." The letter R uncurled inside her into an entire name, and the feeling of the dream became a location on a map. The sidewalk seemed to tilt and then correct. "Alex," she said, soft with shock and recognition that landed in her bones before it reached her brain. He had the good sense not to step closer as the name traveled between them like a bird deciding to land. He simply held out her notebook with both hands. "You should read this to yourself, not in front of me," he said quietly. "Or, if you want me to read it, I'll read it the way I hope you'd want to be read, carefully, without trying to be right." "Read it," she said. He opened to the first page and inhaled as if the words had a smell. His eyes moved with the reverence of a person navigating a place that could be holy or haunted. He smiled once, small and involuntary, at a sentence that had made him in his own private mythology. He winced once, small and involuntary, at a sentence that pinned him too neatly. He read the part where she described chasing a man from a diner into a park and stopping at a baseball field to root for blue, then saw himself lifted from a page into air. He closed the notebook and returned it with both hands. "You wrote the feeling right," he said. "Like the universe paused and asked if we were paying attention. And you didn't make me better than I am. Thank you for that." "I wrote so I wouldn't forget," she said, voice trembling with relief and terror braided tight. "Not you, just that it was possible to feel the beginning of a life again." They stood like that, the city moving around them like a river that always knows the bank. He didn't reach for her hand, so she reached for his, because she had learned the difference between being led by a story and taking a step inside one. "What if we give this a month?" he asked, voice steady with courage. "No dreams, no prophecies, no checking whether the rain smells like it did in the dream. We go for walks, we eat messy sandwiches, we figure out if we like each other under fluorescent grocery store lights. After that, if you want to burn the binder, I'll do it. If you want to put both notebooks in a box and never carry them again, I will. I don't want to be a destiny. I want to be Alex." "A month," she said, air unclenching around the word. "With a rule." "Name it," he said. "We are not obligated to be the people our younger selves imagined," she said. "We're allowed to be better or worse or different." "Page 1 of the new book," he said, smiling like rain on a hot day. They began with small things because small things were safe, and safe was where choice could live. Their first walk took them down the long stretch of park that curved past the baseball diamond, where blue jerseys had once stolen her breath. The air smelled like cut grass and thawed earth, the field still damp from last night's rain. Stacy pointed out the faint chalk lines ghosting the dirt, already washed thin. "You know," she said, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets, "I still don't understand how baseball scoring works." Carl, no, Alex, though she wasn't sure she was ready to use that name aloud yet, laughed. That's the most honest thing I've heard all week. It's true, she said, smiling sideways at him. I just cheer when everyone else does. That's as good a system as any, he said. Besides, cheering for the wrong thing can be its own kind of loyalty. They shared a sandwich from a bodega afterward, sitting on the curb because the bread dripped mustard and the napkins were flimsy as tissue. When a rivulet of sauce streaked down her wrist, Stacy tried to wipe it discreetly, but he caught her fumbling and handed her his napkin without a word. Messy sandwiches are a relationship test, she said, dabbing her wrist. And? He asked, one eyebrow raised. You passed, she said, lips twitching into a grin. Their days filled with such small tests, none of which looked like destiny, but all of which felt more important than dreams. A movie in a too-cold theater where their hands brushed in the popcorn bucket and stayed clasped for the last half hour. An argument over whether the city's new train schedule was efficient or ridiculous, carried out with mock seriousness and an undertone of real heat. A grocery trip where Stacy admitted she had never learned how to pick out a good cantaloupe, and Carl showed her how to tap and listen for the low, hollow sound that meant ripeness. At night, she sometimes dreamed again, though the dreams blurred. When they did, she woke with her heart clanging, then reached for her phone. Saw a kid with a dinosaur cape today. Bought new shoelaces. You? She would text. His replies always came quickly. Burned the bagel. Fixed Earl's leaky faucet. Spilled coffee on myself twice. Facts like stepping stones across fog. 2 weeks in, Mary insisted on meeting him. She arrived at Stacy's apartment in full protective friend mode, arms folded, expressions severe. Carl knocked at 7 with a 6-pack of craft beer and a bouquet of tulips in cheerful yellows and reds. Flowers, Mary said dryly as she opened the door. Bold move. What if she's allergic? Then I'll buy antihistamines and take the flowers home, Carl said without missing a beat. Mary eyed him for a long moment, then stepped aside. You may enter. The evening unfolded with pizza and small talk. Carl told stories about his friend Earl, who had once tried to install a shelf upside down and refused to admit it until the book slid off. Stacy found herself laughing harder than she meant to, the sound startling her as if it came from a younger self she hadn't heard in years. Later, when Carl stepped into the kitchen to fetch more drinks, Mary leaned close. I don't hate him, she whispered, as if the words themselves were a concession. High praise from you, Stacy murmured, smiling. Mary narrowed her eyes. Just keep your feet on the ground. If he starts talking fate when you need him to say, I'm sorry, I'll douse him with holy water and sarcasm. Stacy pressed Mary's hand, gratitude thick in her throat. I promise. The month unfolded like scaffolding. Ordinary, sturdy, rising almost without their noticing. She learned that he hummed when he wrote, tuneless but steady. He learned that she whispered little reminders to herself when driving. Don't forget the turn. Check the mirror. You've got this. They discovered the shape of each other's silences. His before he created something with his hands. Hers before she let herself feel something too big. Not every day was easy. There were arguments, small at first, then larger. About time, about money, about how much of themselves they owed to the past, to family, to each other. One evening, tension snapped like a rope too taut, and Stacy left the apartment mid-sentence, keys jangling in her grip. She walked until her calves ached, until the street lamps blurred. When she returned, Carl was still there, sitting cross-legged on the couch, with his hands folded. He looked up, eyes tired but steady. I hear the part where you felt alone, he said quietly. And I need you to hear the part where I felt invisible, she replied, her voice trembling. They did not fix everything that night, but they listened. That, she realized, was its own kind of repair. On the 23rd day, she hosted an open house in a stately home with creaking floorboards and chandeliers that remembered better centuries. She'd staged the rooms with lilies and glass vases, their fragrance heavy and sweet. The morning had been bright, but by noon, a storm thickened the sky. By 1, lightning stitched white scars across the clouds. Carl had promised to bring her coffee. She looked for him between conversations with buyers, the rooms swelling with strangers and umbrellas dripping on hardwood. At 1:15, he still hadn't arrived. At 1:30, thunder walked the roof. A delivery man stepped in, soaked to the skin, holding a paper bag. "Madam, madam," he called over the sound of rain. Stacy's pulse jumped hard. For a split second, she was back in the dream, cafe window, notebook, voice behind her. But the man glanced at the receipt and shook his head. "Wrong house. Sorry." She laughed, too bright, relief and disappointment tangling like knots. "Next door," she directed, voice lighter than she felt. At 2, Carl arrived with 2 cups of coffee, hair damp, grin sheepish. "Earl's apartment tried to become a swimming pool," he explained. "I had to help him before the ceiling caved in, but I brought caffeine as penance." She took the cup, warmth seeping into her palms, and rolled her eyes fondly. "You're forgiven. Barely." When the last of the buyers left and the storm softened into rain, they stood at the wide front window, the city blurred and dripping beyond. Their reflections hovered in the glass. Her in her neat blazer, him in his damp shirt. 2 people both real and somehow spectral. "Maybe the notebooks were never maps," Stacy said softly. "Maybe they were just compasses. We mistook direction for destination." Carl turned toward her, eyes shadowed but lit. "Maybe fate isn't a plan. Maybe it's just posture, a way of paying attention." Her throat tightened. "And if paying attention tells us someday that we're wrong for each other?" "Then we'll be honest enough to go," he said. "I don't want to keep you because of a dream. I want to keep you because you clap when the plane lands, don't deny it, and because you run after strangers to return what they've lost. That's the you I see. That's the you I want." She bit back a laugh, tears burning hot in her eyes. "I clap when complicated things work," she admitted. "Then let's see if we can be a complicated thing that works," he said. When she leaned against him, his damp sleeve cold against her cheek, it felt less like stepping into prophecy and more like stepping into weather. Messy, ordinary, alive. On the 30th day, Mary arrived carrying a bottle of champagne and 3 paper cups. She plunked the bag down on Stacy's table, bracelets clattering like bells, and surveyed the scene as if she were officiating a trial. "All right," she said, her voice brisk with authority. "It's been a month. You 2 have survived each other's bad habits, weathered a thunderstorm, and managed not to combust. Time to mark the occasion. Where are the infamous notebooks?" Carl shifted in his seat, looking to Stacy. She met his eyes, then nodded. He crossed the room and fetched the box from the closet shelf where they had stashed it. He set it on the table with the care of someone placing a fragile relic. The cardboard was ordinary, but its contents hummed with everything they hadn't said. Mary eyed it like a suspicious witness. "So," she said, tapping the lid with one bright fingernail, "do we burn them, bury them, or laminate them for future grandchildren?" Stacy smiled faintly. "None of the above. We agreed. We're not obligated to be the people those notebooks imagined. They can stay here, but they don't run the show anymore." Carl added, "They're part of how we got here, but they don't get to dictate where we go next." Mary softened, her tough edges folding just enough to reveal warmth. "All right, then," she said, popping the cork. It ricocheted off the ceiling, clattered into the sink, and sent them all into laughter. She poured champagne into the flimsy cups, fizz spilling over her fingers. To choice, not prophecy. They clinked their cups together. The bubbles stung Stacy's nose, and she laughed again, freer than she had in years. That night, after Mary left with a satisfied smile, Carl and Stacy carried the box back to the closet. Neither reached inside. They closed the door on it gently, as though tucking away an old photograph they didn't need to frame. Then they turned toward the kitchen, where the remains of pizza and champagne waited, and toward each other. Life after the month did not suddenly smooth into fairy tale perfection. There were arguments about groceries, about whether to save or splurge, about whose turn it was to do laundry. Carl was restless when he went too many days without using his hands to build something. Stacy grew irritable if she couldn't carve out quiet to write. They found themselves clashing not over notebooks or destiny, but over the ordinary friction of living in parallel. But they had made a rule: listen, repair, and try again. One evening, after a particularly sharp disagreement about time, Stacy needing space, Carl wanting more of her presence, he sat at the window staring out at the building across the street. Someone had left a television on in an empty room, the flicker visible through curtains. "Do you think we dreamed each other too kind?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Kinder than we can actually be?" Stacy came to stand beside him, arms crossed loosely. She considered the question, then leaned her shoulder against his. "No," she said softly. "I think we dreamed each other brave. Kindness is something we have to do daily. It's not free. We earn it, or we lose it." He turned to kiss her then, a slow, grounding kiss that tasted of both apology and devotion. The room held its breath around them, as if learning to trust. Weeks passed, and the rhythms deepened. They discovered small joys in each other's company: pancakes on Saturday mornings, her humming while she washed dishes, his habit of scribbling down overheard sentences from strangers. They texted each other tiny dispatches from their days. Woman on the bus carried a cactus in a backpack, or man in grocery store shouted at his cantaloupe, then apologized. Sometimes the dreams still came, not with the precision of the old visions, but as echoes, half-formed fragments, feelings without context. When they did, Stacy didn't rush to write them down. Instead, she leaned closer to the life she was already building with Alex Rogue, the man who had once said his name was Carl because he wasn't ready to be known. One night, long after midnight, Stacy woke to the sensation of being called by name, not by a dream, but by the hush of the room itself. She turned and found Alex sleeping beside her, his hand loosely curled toward her on the pillow. She slid her fingers into his, and his grip closed instinctively, as though his body had been waiting to complete the gesture for years. She did not reach for her notebook. She wanted this one in her bones, not on paper. Spring tipped into summer. On a warm Sunday, they returned to the diner where everything had begun: the salad she never finished, the binder left behind. The chalkboard out front had a new message scrawled in messy chalk: tomato soup that forgives your past. Inside, the air buzzed with the smell of frying oil and too strong coffee. They slid into the same booth where Carl, Alex, had once sat scribbling furiously. Stacy touched the table's scarred wood, then reached for his hand. "You ever think about how close this all came to not happening?" she asked. He squeezed her fingers. "Every day." When they stood to leave, a man in another booth shot up suddenly, binder still open on the table. He dashed toward the door, his face pale with panic. A waitress shouted after him, "Sir, your notebook!" Stacy and Alex watched him disappear into sunlight, binder still lying on the booth. For a moment, the loop seemed to gape wide again, inviting them to fall back into it. Alex looked at Stacy, then at the abandoned binder, then back to her. "I have everything I need," he said quietly. She smiled, heart swelling. "Me too." They stepped into the afternoon hand in hand, the sunlight folding around them. Months later, Stacy stood in her kitchen, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. The apartment was cluttered with signs of a life shared: his jacket on the back of a chair, her notebook half buried under yesterday's mail, a vase of tulips gone soft at the edges. She felt the hum of ordinary happiness vibrating through the room like a low chord. Alex appeared in the doorway, hair rumpled, shirt wrinkled. "Good morning," he said, voice still rough from sleep. She turned and smiled, pressing a mug into his hands. "Good morning." Let's see what we make today. The dreams had once been a prophecy, then a burden, then a compass. But now they were something simpler, a story that had done its job. Stacy no longer needed them to tell her where to go. She was here, in the warm light of her own kitchen, with a man whose name was no longer a mystery, but a truth. Alex Rogue. And as they stood together sipping coffee, laughter spilling into the steam, Stacy realized the most important chapter was the one unwritten, waiting in the blank pages ahead, hers to shape, theirs to share.